There's a freezer here that I want to get into. It's locked, but...
Viewer discretion is advised for this educational documentary. Thank you so much to all of my patrons. If your name is on screen right now, then you're a legend. Our love and respect goes out to all those affected by this dark case. Henriet Su was born in 1984 in Hungary to mother Mary. She left her motherland in the late 2000s. This was after the marriage with the father of two of her three children ended. She spent a few years in Germany before arriving in the UK in 2012. There she worked as an escort in East London. After briefly returning home to give her third child up for adoption, she then moved to Birmingham in 2014 with a Hungarian man who badly maltreated her. He promised her work and opportunities to better her life, but that never materialized. Instead, he disappeared with her passport and birth certificate. This effectively left her stranded in the country. Betrayed and desperate, Henriet eventually made her way to London, and there she found herself in the throes of yet another horrifically toxic relationship. Luckily though, this time she got out faster. When she then became homeless, she found help and support at the Welcome Centre. This is a charity organisation based in Ilford. The people who knew Henriet well described her as cheery, affectionate and determined, despite the circumstances that she was in. Henriet also really enjoyed drawing. The people who knew her thought it was a mechanism for escape, taking her mind somewhere else as she was extremely vulnerable during that time of her life. Despite this, Henriet pulled herself together and had plans to transform her life. She enjoyed group activities and was actively seeking to start a college education. But that was when she came under the influence of a very violent man, a man named David Dallison. He forced Henriet back into escorting, a profession she'd barely just escaped. He used illicit substances and violence as a method of control. Things came to a head in January of 2016. She was admitted to hospital for falling from the 5th floor balcony of the Ilford Tower block. The apartment she fell from belonged to Dallison. She suffered multiple injuries, fractured ribs and shoulder, and was admitted to hospital. When Henriet Su was at her lowest, she then met Zahid Yunus. MJ Mustafa, otherwise known as Can or MJ, was born in 1986. She was of Turkish Cypriot descent. She grew up with a cousin, Aisha Hussein, under the watchful eyes of their mother. MJ worked as a waitress at Upton Park, West Ham's football ground. She was a proud mother of 3 children. One of MJ's biggest dreams was to help people who were struggling. She was very loving, she was cheery and kind. It was said she would do anything for those that she cared about. However, things started going downhill when MJ started having money troubles. She had to send her 3 children to live with a family member while she struggled to stabilize her situation. Things went from bad to worse when she got evicted from her apartment for not paying her bills for the month. A combination of dyslexia and her struggling financial situation meant that things spiraled easily and quickly. She turned to alcohol and illicit substances, and she started hanging out with people she met at the Custom House. It was there she met Zahid Yunus. Canning Town is home to new residential tower developments in London. These are aimed at providing affordable housing to low to mid-income families. The area has a strong Turkish culture and is littered with pizzerias, fast food spots, hotels and waterside restaurants. And it is a small flat on a street in this vibrant part of East London that Henriet and MJ lived in after they met Zahid. 38-year-old Zahid Yunus was cut from the same cloth as the most violent and evil elements of London. He was aggressive, arrogant, and had a history of maltreating and violating women, a history of grooming and even kidnapping. And for years, he simply got away with it. The earliest recorded account of his behaviour was in 2001. He started seeing a 16-year-old college student, and she eventually got pregnant. At first, he seemed very attentive and paid me lots of attention, she said. And then he changed. He became, and I quote, quite extremely paranoid about me looking at other men. At some point, Eunice even locked her in a cupboard. He would only let her out when she agreed to have intimate relations with him. He continued to terrorize the girl for years, and at some point even threatened the girl's mother. On one occasion, he even appeared in her home and grabbed her by the neck. He threatened to take her child to Pakistan. Around this same time, authorities reported that Zahid disturbingly was also grooming a 12-year-old girl. Eunice was 19 at the time, and after repeating the same pattern of attention, paranoia, and maltreatment, he forced the underage girl into an unofficial marriage with him in 2004 at a mosque. The girl, who was 14 at the time of the marriage, said she didn't speak Arabic, and therefore it was only after the ceremony was over that she realised what had happened. Eunice was subsequently arrested and charged with assault, false imprisonment, violations of a child, and 26 other charges. But he was still acquitted by the court after his trial. He only pleaded guilty to around 6 of the 26 charges brought before the court, and therefore he was sentenced to just 30 months in prison. According to another 17-year-old girl, Eunice went back to his old habit not long after he left prison. He moved himself into her flat and began to hover around her when anybody came to visit. He then stopped her from leaving her flat, and eventually the real maltreatment started. According to her, it was brutal, systemic, and constant. He used hammers, sharp kitchen implements, barbecue forks, and lighters. During this time, she suffered multiple injuries. At one stage, she was unable to walk after she was thrown out of her window. He kept her from reporting him by threatening to end her family's lives, and threatening to distribute videos of her being violated by him. Thankfully, her mother grew worried enough to call the police, and there was enough evidence to charge Eunice slightly more seriously this time. However, he was sentenced to only 5 years in prison. This was because of his pleas and admitting to the charges of assault, of grievous bodily harm, and unlawful wounding. Eunice was sentenced in 2008, and when he got out, he was somehow declared a medium risk and monitored by the police. Henriet Su met Eunice in the hospital she was admitted to after an incident with her ex, David Dallison, in January of 2016. He called himself a boxer because of his domineering size, and according to Henriet, he was kind and affectionate. She fell for him instantly. After months of seeing each other, Henriet decided to leave the shelter she stayed at the time and moved in with Eunice, but only after trying to assure the charity staff that this was a good idea. She insisted that Eunice didn't have a toxic or possessive personality. So, Henriet moved in with Eunice in his Canning Town apartment. And, predictably, he began to show his true colours shortly after that. Henriet failed to turn up in court to testify in a case against Dallison. This was the ex-partner who had previously violated and maltreated her. This was a case that she had been eager to pursue, so she really should have been there. However, she wasn't there due to Eunice. To prevent the police from seeking her out, he forced her to leave a message saying she wasn't feeling well. At this time, alarm bells should have been ringing. The last reported sighting of Henriet was in East London in 2016. There, she was seen in the company of Eunice. This was when he received a penalty possession for illicit substances. Sadly, nobody came looking for Henriet after she disappeared. MJ came to know Eunice through her vices that often led her to criminals, and it was through one of them that she met Zahid. He lived near MJ at the time, and he was often seen in the local shops alongside her. MJ's family saw her for the last time in May of 2018 at her mother's home. When nobody could find her, she was reported missing by her family. The missing report inquiry that came about from their report left much to be desired. The Metropolitan Police classified MJ's case as medium risk. The police refused to offer up a reward for information. They didn't allow the family to announce her missing status on television or to appeal her case. Given what the police had gathered about MJ's past, they presumed that she had simply run away and would return when she was ready. So the Mustafa family had to investigate her disappearance on their own. They found MJ's old mobile, which they passed to the police, but frustratingly nothing came of it at that time. In July of 2018, the police officers in charge of watching Eunice showed up at his home to ask about MJ, but he denied having ever known her personally. Eunice claimed that she was a friend of a friend, and the police simply encouraged him to report any sightings of her that he may have. Up until 2019, the police kept close contact with Eunice. They often exchanged calls and text messages and swung by for routine visits, for interviews, and for updates on his life. Eunice didn't shy away from these either. He even contacted them 26 times to lodge complaints of his own. Perhaps that was why the discovery that followed next came as such a surprise. In late April of 2019, an elderly missionary woman placed a call to the Met Police about a potentially ill or dead person. They were supposed to meet over 3 days ago, but she'd been unable to reach him. Her friend, whom she was in truth supporting, claimed to be sick with Crohn's disease. In a message exchanged between them, Zahid Eunice had declared that he only had her and God. So perhaps he was a man ready to change. Throughout this relationship, the missionary had sent Zahid over £1,000. When the communication stopped, she tried visiting his apartment. She knocked on the door, but she heard nothing back. She even tried looking in through the windows. When there was no response at all, she made the decision to call the Metropolitan Police. Perhaps something terrible had happened to Eunice inside this apartment. The police quickly came knocking on his door, but still there was no sign of him anywhere. No response to calls, knocks, or shouting of his name. So they climbed in through the window. They entered into an apartment in disarray, somewhere that hadn't been properly cleaned in years. Once inside, they searched for any indication as to where Zahid may have gone. The officers kept an eye out for hospital letters, doctor's notes, and other things of that nature. At the very end of a small hallway, they spotted a utility closet that was blocked by several objects. After clearing the way, they opened the door. Standing in there was a large freezer closed with a lock. On a hunch, they decided to check what was inside. The freezer was surrounded by flies. This is the real police body cam footage of this discovery.
There's a freezer here that I want to get into. It's locked, but... yeah.
With some effort, they pried open the lock and came to a shocking sight. Sheets of plastic and air fresheners partially buried something that stuck out the edge of the freezer. Upon inspection, it was a human foot. In an instant, the flat was transformed into a crime scene. Police were now in a race to determine the person to whom it belonged. Investigators now swarmed Eunice's apartment. The hunt for more evidence to discover exactly what had happened here was on. Sarah Thurkel was one of the country's leading CSI instructors. She was in charge of identifying the body. With the help of her team, she gathered fingerprints and biological evidence like the dead flies. Dr. Carl Harrison, a forensic anthropologist, was brought in to identify the body in the freezer. While they allowed the body to defrost naturally, the investigators focused on establishing who else had been in the apartment aside from Eunice. They scoured every surface of the house for fingerprints and DNA evidence, and the police started canvassing the area. They wanted to understand the personality and the whereabouts of Eunice. Quickly, his neighbours painted a picture of a disagreeable man, someone with anger issues and a history of violence. A request was made for his records while the CSIs pieced together the identity of several women who had been in Eunice's flat. One of them was a pack of medication for somebody named MJ Mustafa, or MJ. Someone they now discovered had been missing for over 11 months. At this point, the authorities were several days into the investigation. The body was now defrosted enough to analyse. Examiners noted a few tattoos that matched those that MJ was noted to have. The body's features also seemed to match the hair and facial structure of MJ. After acquiring DNA evidence from her immediate family, the police were able to confirm that it was indeed MJ's body that was found in the freezer. Shortly after MJ's body was identified, the police began to seek out the women whose items were found in Eunice's apartment during the investigation. They were very forthcoming about Eunice and his history, allowing them to identify him as the most likely suspect. Fingerprint evidence also established that it was Eunice who dumped MJ's body in the freezer. At this juncture, the real hunt for Zahid Yunus began. They combed CCTV for a sighting of him, but they found nothing. Around the same time, news came of a second body in the freezer directly below MJ's. They quickly confirmed the body to be that of Henriet Su. She was one of the only women linked to Eunice that the police had not been able to track down. There were bags of shredded paper detailing her feelings, her thoughts, emotions, and her drawings during the time she spent with Eunice. She mentioned him directly, talked about him maltreating her, and how he displayed the same patterns of control he had used time and time again. This was the behaviour that he was already known for, but behaviour that he was free to carry out again and again. Henriette's DNA was already in the system. This is because of the nature of the violation from the case she had with David Dallison. Zahid Yunus was tracked down and arrested not long after. The police waited for him at his brother's apartment and apprehended him with force. Although he was now in custody, the investigation was still far from over. The police discovered MJ's phone under Eunice's couch, and her mobile data revealed that they did, in fact, know each other, and they knew each other intimately. They also found Henriette's fingerprint in his cooker, and both of the women's bodies had injuries concurrent with Eunice's established patterns of violence. Henriette had suffered multiple head traumas, the likely cause of her demise. There were also 58 additional injuries. All of the ribs on the left side of her body were also broken. MJ had serious internal injuries, compression fractures to her sternum, and a number of her ribs were broken as well. Using the timeline of each woman's disappearance, the police were able to determine when they passed away. They estimated that Henriette must have been dead for around 2 years, and MJ for less than 1 year. MJ and Henriette were laid to rest by their respective families, with no small amount of resentment towards the Metropolitan Police, along with the justice system that allowed a monster like Eunice to thrive for so long, free to do what he wanted without being caught. The Mustafa family in particular were furious with law enforcement for the approach to MJ's disappearance. Perhaps if they'd been allowed to be more proactive, all of this could have been over much quicker. The trial of Zahid Yunus lasted 6 long weeks. It drew to a close on September the 3rd. Yunus strung together lie after lie each time evidence was presented. He claimed that he was blackmailed to store the bodies of both women in a freezer, blackmailed by an unnamed and unknown mysterious man. He also insisted he was a decent guy despite everything he'd done in the past. This should have been a provable enough lie for nobody in the court to have trusted a single word that he said. Zahid's chances of receiving a lenient sentence evaporated after all of the women he'd assaulted came forward to testify. This included the 14-year-old that he groomed, the college student that he assaulted, and several other women. Mrs. Justice Chima Grube presided over the court proceedings. As if the evidence and testimony were not damning enough, Yunus lost his cool when he was pressed for information. He called the judge arrogant, and he hurled slurs at one of the victims while she was taking the stand. Yunus was a coward and a bully until the very end. He refused to attend his own sentencing, a sentencing in which he received 38 years to life in prison. Do you think the punishment fits the crime here? What do you think could be done to avoid something like this happening again in the future? Please do let me know down in the comments. Be careful out there, and I'll see you soon.